Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the night is long, the rain is steady, and the darkest stories unfold in whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the flickering oil lamps of the 19th century and step onto the endless highways of America in the 1990s. Long stretches of asphalt, glowing truck stoplights, and the hum of 18-wheelers carrying their loads through the dark. The road is lonely, and for some, that loneliness becomes a breeding ground for something far more dangerous than fatigue. Women began to disappear. Hitchhikers, drifters, sex workers, the forgotten, the vulnerable, the ones who lived on the edge of society. Their bodies were later found discarded by highways and remote fields. For years, the murders blended into the background of America's restless road system, unnoticed, unconnected, until the killer himself began to write. Letters filled with confessions, signed with a chilling mark, a simple smiley face. The newspapers gave him a name, the happy-faced killer. A man who hid in plain sight, a father, a truck driver, a voice on the road who seemed ordinary. But behind the wheel, behind that practiced smile, lived a predator who craved recognition for his cruelty. So let the rain fall, let the world outside fade away, as we tell the haunting story of Keith Jesperson, the happy-faced killer. Keith Hunter Jesperson was born on April 6, 1955, in Chilliwack, a small community in British Columbia of Canada. At first glance, his childhood looked ordinary, a family of 5 children, a father who worked hard to keep the family afloat, a mother who tried to maintain order in the household. But behind the closed doors of their modest home, shadows were already gathering. Keith was a large baby, and as he grew, his size set him apart. By the time he was 6, he was noticeably bigger and taller than his peers. For many children, size can bring admiration, even a sense of power. For Keith, it brought isolation. Instead of being treated with respect, he was mocked. His classmates called him a gore, monster, or worse, turning his physical difference into a source of constant humiliation. This was compounded by the cruelty of his father, Les Jesperson. Les was a strict disciplinarian who valued toughness above all else. To him, weakness was shameful, and emotion was a defect to be beaten out of his children. Keith, sensitive and awkward, was an easy target. Les's punishments were not just physical but psychological. He would ridicule Keith in front of the other children, laugh at his clumsiness, and push him into fights he could not win. Rather than building resilience, these moments carved deep lines of resentment and anger into the boy's mind. Keith's eyes, which could have been a source of protection, became another reason for his father to challenge him, to prove that even the biggest child could still be made to kneel. By the age of 7, Keith was already carrying a burden heavier than most children could imagine. He had no close friends. The few who tried to connect with him were chased away by his awkwardness or by the whispers that surrounded him. His siblings teased him mercilessly. His schoolmates saw him as an outsider. Alone, he began to drift inward, creating a world where anger and revenge provided some twisted form of comfort. He would sit for hours imagining ways to retaliate against those who hurt him. Teachers saw a boy with potential, intelligent, with a sharp memory, but that potential was clouded by the constant trouble that followed him. His anger would erupt in sudden bursts, leaving broken toys, destroyed belongings, or injured animals in his wake. It was with animals that Keith's darker impulses first found expression. Like many future killers, he started small. At first, it was insects, pulling the legs off flies, watching them crawl helplessly. Then birds, whose necks he twisted with his bare hands. Cats and dogs were next. By his early teens, Jesperson admitted later, he had killed multiple animals, often in ways designed to prolong suffering. He electrocuted them, hanged them, and watched with fascination as life drained away. For Keith, killing was not about necessity or anger, it was about control. In a life where he felt powerless, mocked by peers, crushed by his father, here was a Rome where he decided who lived and who died. Each act of cruelty fed his growing hunger, while at the same time training him in detachment. Once the deed was done, he could walk away without remorse, carrying the memory like a trophy stored in his imagination. Jesperson's size, which had been a curse in his early years, began to shape another aspect of his identity as he grew older. He towered over his peers, eventually reaching 6 feet 6 inches, with a broad frame that made him look even more intimidating. But inside, he remained the same insecure, isolated boy. The contradiction between appearance and reality deepened his sense of alienation. To the outside world, he was a giant who should have been confident and strong. Inside, he felt like a perpetual outcast, rejected by everyone who mattered. That dissonance, psychologists later argued, became part of the engine of his rage, a desperate need to prove his worth, not through kindness or achievement, but through domination. Keith's adolescence was marked by frustration and thwarted attempts at connection. He longed for friendship, for acceptance, but whenever he tried to reach out, his clumsy demeanor and reputation worked against him. Girls avoided him, frightened by his size or put off by his awkward advances. Boys challenged him, either to prove themselves against the giant or to humiliate him further. His home offered no refuge. His father continued to belittle him, telling him he would never amount to anything, laughing when he failed at sports, berating him for poor performance in chores. Keith began to retreat even further into fantasies, not just of revenge but of control, of having someone entirely at his mercy. Around this time, Keith discovered the dual edge of his imagination. On one side, it gave him a place to escape, a world where he could rewrite the rules. On the other, it became the breeding ground for violent fantasies that grew darker with each passing year. By his mid-teens, he was imagining what it would feel like to kill a person. Not just in the heat of anger, but deliberately, carefully, with the same detachment he had practiced on animals. He thought about how he would do it, how he would choose his victims, how he would avoid being caught. The fantasies were meticulous, rehearsed in his mind like scripts. In this way, Keith was already shaping the pattern of the happy-faced killer years before his first human victim. But the outward signs of this transformation were subtle. To most of the adults in his life, Keith was simply a troubled boy. Teachers noted his intelligence, but also his disruptive behavior. Counselors occasionally suggested discipline or stricter routines. No one imagined they were looking at the early development of a serial killer. His violence toward animals was hidden, his fantasies private. His anger, though visible, was often dismissed as typical teenage rebellion. And so he slipped through the cracks, a boy growing into a man with no one to guide him away from the path he was building for himself. When Keith was a teenager, the family moved to the United States, eventually settling in Selah, Washington. Here, in a new environment, the same patterns repeated. Once again, Jesperson was the outsider, the Canadian transplant with a strange accent and a reputation that soon followed him. He tried to join sports teams, leveraging his size and strength, but he lacked coordination. Coaches mocked him, players sidelined him, and the familiar cycle of humiliation returned. At home, his father's disdain was undiminished. Les saw Keith's failures as a reflection of weakness, further proof that his son was destined for mediocrity. Instead of offering support, he doubled down on criticism, pushing Keith further into isolation. It was during this period that Keith's interest in control over others began to manifest in smaller, more troubling ways. He bullied younger children, used his size to intimidate those who could not fight back, and tested boundaries with petty acts of cruelty. These moments were often overlooked, the kind of behavior people excused as boys being boys. But for Keith, they were rehearsals, each one refining his sense of power, each one eroding the fragile line between thought and action. He was no longer content to live only in his fantasies. Slowly, carefully, he was moving toward a reality where those fantasies could be acted out. As Keith entered his late teens, he remained largely invisible to the wider world. He was not a standout student, not an athlete, not socially prominent. He was the tall, awkward boy who drifted at the edges of school life, someone people noticed but did not truly see. And that invisibility, combined with his physical presence, created the perfect paradox. He was large enough to intimidate, strange enough to repel, but forgettable enough to disappear into the background. It was a combination that would later make him a deadly predator on America's highways, a man who could pick up women, kill them, and drive away unnoticed. By the time he graduated high school, Jesperson was already a man carrying deep resentments, violent fantasies, and a growing conviction that the world had rejected him. He had killed animals, bullied children, rehearsed murders in his mind. He was on the cusp of adulthood, but he was carrying a child's bitterness and an emerging killer's cold detachment. The boy mocked as Igor had become a man who believed he had nothing to lose, nothing to prove, and nothing holding him back. And so Keith Jesperson left school and stepped into the wider world, a world of long roads, endless nights, and strangers who would never see him coming. The shadows of his childhood had shaped him, twisting pain into rage, rejection into cruelty, isolation into deadly fantasies. The giant boy who never fit in was about to become the man whose smile would haunt headlines, a smile drawn not in joy but in blood. After leaving school, Keith Jesperson entered a world that seemed both vast and indifferent. The open roads of North America became his domain, a place where his size and awkwardness no longer made him the subject of ridicule but instead blended into the anonymous churn of laborers and drifters who kept the wheels of industry turning. He worked various jobs in his late teens and early 20s, but it was behind the wheel of a truck that he found his calling. The highways offered something he had never experienced before: freedom. There were no teachers mocking him, no classmates whispering, no father glaring at him with disappointment. Out here, it was just Keith, the hum of the engine, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching into the horizon. But freedom came with another kind of burden: isolation. Driving across state lines, spending long nights in truck stops, eating alone in diners where no one knew his name, Keith discovered that solitude was both a comfort and a curse. On one hand, it shielded him from the rejection he had endured all his life. On the other, it amplified the darkness that had already taken root. Loneliness gave his fantasies room to grow. Without anyone to anchor him, to challenge him, or to remind him of human connection, Keith retreated deeper into the violent world inside his mind. The life of a long-haul trucker is grueling. Hours stretch into days, days into weeks. The road becomes both workplace and home, and the sense of transience seeps into every part of existence. Truckers are witnesses to the underbelly of society: hitchhikers drifting with no destination, sex workers trying to make a living in the shadows of neon truck stops, lost souls chasing escape on highways that promise everything and deliver nothing. For Jesperson, these encounters became opportunities. To other men, they were simply fellow travelers. To Keith, they were potential prey. It was during these years that Jesperson began testing the boundaries of his impulses. He would strike up conversations with women at truck stops, his towering figure both intimidating and oddly disarming when paired with his calm, almost shy demeanor. Sometimes he paid for sex, sometimes he offered rides, but in each interaction he rehearsed control. He observed how easily women entrusted themselves to him, how vulnerable they became once inside the cab of his truck, far from witnesses, far from safety. He told himself these were just encounters, ordinary exchanges between lonely travelers. But beneath the surface, he was cataloging possibilities, envisioning what it would take to cross the line from thought to action. Jesperson married young, trying to build the kind of ordinary life that eluded him as a child. He married Rose Huck, a woman who seemed to offer stability, and together they had 3 children. For a time, he tried to wear the mask of normalcy. He lived in a modest home, played the role of husband and father, went to work, came home. To outsiders, the Jesperson household looked like any other working-class family. But behind closed doors, the darkness continued to stir. Keith's temper was volatile, his frustrations bubbling over into anger that frightened his wife and children. He felt trapped between the expectations of family life and the restless freedom of the road. The marriage eventually collapsed, leaving Keith even more bitter, more convinced that he was destined for isolation. It was during his trucking years, after the marriage ended, that Keith began to drift fully into the double life that would later define him. On one side, he was a provider, a worker, a man earning his living on the highways. On the other, he was a predator in waiting, seeking out moments when he could exercise control over the vulnerable. The fantasies that had haunted him since childhood no longer seemed abstract. They pressed against him during long drives, whispering through the rhythm of tires on pavement, urging him to act. The truck stops where Jesperson lingered became stages for these urges. Neon lights flickered against rain-slicked asphalt, the smell of diesel mixing with coffee and fried food in roadside diners. It was in these liminal spaces that he studied potential victims. Prostitutes who leaned against the sides of trailers, offering quick relief to weary drivers. Young women hitchhiking across the country, hoping for safety in numbers, but often forced to rely on the kindness of strangers. To most, these women were invisible, their lives undocumented, their disappearances unnoticed. To Keith, they were exactly what he wanted: vulnerable, disposable, and unlikely to be missed. Jesperson's job allowed him to cover vast distances, and this mobility would later make him both dangerous and difficult to catch. Each city was temporary, each town a waypoint. If a woman vanished in Oregon, he could be hundreds of miles away in California within a day. If a body was found in Washington, he could be in Nevada before the investigation even began. The anonymity of the road was his camouflage, and he wore it well. Few suspected the quiet trucker of harboring such violence. As the years passed, Keith's need for control escalated. He began practicing intimidation in subtle ways, exerting power over women he picked up without yet resorting to violence. He would grip their arms just a little too tightly, stare at them a little too long, let silence stretch until they grew uneasy. For Jesperson, these moments were experiments, rehearsals for the acts he had long fantasized about. He found satisfaction not only in physical dominance, but in the psychological unease he could create. Watching fear grow in another person's eyes became its own form of gratification. Despite these growing impulses, Jesperson remained outwardly unremarkable. His size made him noticeable, but his demeanor often disarmed those around him. He was quiet, polite in conversation, and capable of moments of unexpected kindness. This ability to mask his darker self would become one of his most effective tools. When he finally crossed the line into murder, it was this mask of ordinariness that allowed him to lure victims without raising alarm. People saw a large, lonely man, perhaps a little odd, but not a monster. That illusion would cost many women their lives. The first killing, when it came, was less a sudden break than the culmination of years of preparation. But even before that act, Jesperson was already living like a predator, circling his prey, testing boundaries, feeding his hunger in small ways. The road amplified this evolution. Each long drive was time to imagine, to plan, to relive fantasies. The miles became a meditation on violence, the hum of the engine a soundtrack to his inner world. The truck was no longer just a vehicle, it was a hunting ground, a cage, a place where strangers could step inside and never be seen again. Jesperson's growing detachment from ordinary human connection also played a role. His marriage had failed, his relationships were strained, his family ties weakened. The normal bonds that might have anchored him were fraying. In their place was only the road, the solitude, and the fantasies. Without intimacy, without love, Jesperson's only sense of connection came through control, and eventually, through killing. The loneliness of the highways, which could drive some men to despair, drove him deeper into his darkness. By the late 1980s, Jesperson had already begun laying the groundwork for the crimes that would make him infamous. He had a reputation among fellow truckers as a bit strange, but nothing that raised alarms. He was known to spend hours alone, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes writing notes no one ever read. He carried within him the memory of every humiliation, every rejection, every cruel word from his father, his classmates, his wife. And he nurtured those memories like embers, fueling the fire of resentment that would soon erupt in violence. Lonely roads had become both his refuge and his curse. They gave him the freedom to disappear, to shed one identity and take on another. But they also fed the monster that had been growing inside him since childhood. With each mile, with each empty stretch of highway, the line between thought and action grew thinner. Soon, he would step fully across it. Soon, Keith Jesperson would claim his first human life, and the happy-faced killer would be born. By the early 1990s, Keith Jesperson had lived most of his adult life in the shadows of highways, drifting from place to place, hiding in the anonymity of the road. He was not yet known to the world, not yet the happy-faced killer, but inside he was already brimming with years of fantasies that demanded release. For decades, he had killed animals, imagined the act of killing humans, and tested boundaries with women he met on his routes. The road had been a rehearsal hall, his mind a dark stage where violence played out in endless variations. Eventually, the curtain would rise on reality. The first victim was a young woman named Tanja Bennett. It was January 1990 when Jesperson met her. The night was cold in Portland, Oregon, and Keith had stopped at a local bar, a rare decision for someone who often kept to himself. Tanja was there too, a woman in her early 20s with a kind face and a hopeful spirit. She had a developmental disability, which made her more trusting than most, eager to connect with others in ways that sometimes put her at risk. For Jesperson, she was the perfect target, vulnerable, open, and willing to talk to a man who looked lonely himself. At first, their meeting seemed unremarkable. To the other patrons in the bar, it was just another man and woman talking. Jesperson, towering at 6'6", looked like an awkward but harmless giant. Tanja smiled as they conversed, happy to have someone's attention. No one watching them that night could have guessed that she was stepping into the last hours of her life. When Jesperson suggested they leave together, she agreed. In her mind, it was a chance to extend the evening, perhaps make a new friend. In his mind, it was the moment he had been waiting for since childhood. Jesperson took Tanja back to the small rental house he was staying in. The house was nondescript, just another shadow along the road. But inside, Jesperson's fantasies finally collided with reality. According to his later confessions, the night began with ordinary conversation, but it quickly shifted. He wanted control, and Tanja's presence was the trigger he needed. As the minutes passed, his fantasies surged forward, impossible to ignore. When she resisted his sexual advances, the anger that had simmered in him since childhood erupted. He struck her, then bound her. The giant hands that had once killed animals now wrapped around her neck. He squeezed, and the act he had rehearsed for years became real. The murder itself was not theatrical. It was brutal, simple, and terrifyingly quick. For Jesperson, it was both a release and a revelation. The fantasies that had haunted him for so long no longer needed to remain locked inside. Killing, he discovered, was not only possible but intoxicating. He described feeling a sense of calm after her death, a chilling detachment that made him believe he had finally found his purpose. For Tanja, there was no story left to tell. Her life ended in silence, in the grip of a man she had trusted for a few brief hours. But Jesperson's crime did not vanish into the night. After killing her, he faced the practical question of what to do with her body. He placed her in his car and drove into the gorge, a rugged area outside Portland. There, he discarded her body, leaving her in a ditch as though she were trash. It was an act that reflected not only his cruelty but also his belief that she would not be missed, that society would look away, just as it had always looked away from the vulnerable. He later confessed that he felt confident in his disposal, certain that the anonymity of the road would shield him. In a sense, he was right. But what happened next was something even Jesperson did not anticipate. The murder of Tanja Bennett would set off a chain of events that revealed both the flaws of the justice system and the deep hunger for recognition that would later define him as the happy-faced killer. When Tanja's body was discovered, the police began their investigation with limited leads. She was known to frequent bars, to talk to strangers, and to live a somewhat unstable life. In cases like hers, suspicion often fell quickly on acquaintances, family, or those already marginalized by society. Within weeks, two people came forward claiming responsibility for her death, a woman named Laverne Pavlinek and her boyfriend, John Sosnovsk. Their confessions shocked investigators. Pavlinek told police that Sosnovsk had killed Bennett and that she had helped dispose of the body. Her story was elaborate, detailed, and convincing. She described the murder scene, the supposed motive, even her own supposed role. Investigators, hungry for resolution, accepted her words. In truth, Pavlinek had fabricated the confession. She was trapped in an abusive relationship with Sosnovsk and saw the false confession as a way to free herself. By implicating him in a murder, she believed she could escape his control. What she did not anticipate was how far the justice system would run with her story. Sosnovsk, despite protesting his innocence, was arrested. Both were tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. For a time, the world believed they had found Tanja Bennett's killers. Jesperson watched the case unfold from the sidelines, stunned but also intrigued. The newspapers and television reported on the arrests, the trial, the convictions. Here were two innocent people being punished for his crime, and no one suspected him at all. At first, he felt relief. The attention was off him, and the authorities were satisfied with their supposed killers. But as the weeks turned into months, relief gave way to something else: anger. Jesperson wanted recognition. He had killed, he had done what he had fantasized about for decades, and now someone else was getting the blame. To him, it was unacceptable. The crime was his, and he wanted the world to know it. It was in this context that Jesperson began his notorious practice of writing letters. At first, they were anonymous notes sent to the media and police. He described the murder in detail, details only the killer could know. At the bottom of each letter, he signed a crude drawing of a smiling face, a mocking symbol of his satisfaction. It was a way to claim ownership of his crimes without immediately exposing himself. The smiley face became his signature, a dark parody of happiness marking confessions of death. The letters served purposes for Jesperson. On one level, they satisfied his craving for recognition. He watched as newspapers published excerpts, as law enforcement acknowledged receiving them, as the public became aware of a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. On another level, the letters gave him a sense of control over the narrative. He could taunt the authorities, dictate the terms of his identity, and insert himself into a story that others had tried to write for him. The smiley face was his brand, his way of turning murder into a twisted form of self-expression. For the justice system, the letters were a source of confusion. Pavlinak and Sosnovsk were already behind bars, convicted by a jury. But now someone else claimed responsibility. Could the letters be a hoax, written by a crank craving attention? Or was the real killer still at large? Investigators debated, but ultimately the conviction stood. It would take years before Jesperson's identity as the happy-faced killer would be revealed, and the truth about Bennett's murder confirmed. In the meantime, Pavlinak and Sosnovsk languished in prison, paying for a crime they had not committed. For Jesperson, the experience was formative. He learned that he could kill without being caught, that he could manipulate the narrative from the shadows, and that the authorities were not infallible. More importantly, he discovered the intoxicating power of attention. Killing satisfied his physical urges, but recognition satisfied his ego. Together, they created a cycle he could not resist. With Bennett's death, Jesperson had crossed the line into murder. With the letters, he had crossed another line into a game of cat and mouse with the public itself. In later years, Jesperson would claim that Bennett was only the beginning, that once he had tasted the act of killing, it became a hunger he could not ignore. But what made her murder particularly haunting was not only the violence of the act but the injustice that followed. 2 innocent people were caged while the true killer roamed free, smiling from the cab of his truck, sketching happy faces as though mocking the very idea of justice. For Jesperson, this was not guilt-inducing. It was empowering. He felt untouchable, emboldened to kill again, confident that he could steer the narrative to his liking. The story of Tanja Bennett marks the transition of Keith Jesperson from fantasy to reality, from a man haunted by violent urges to a killer who acted on them. It also marks the birth of the happy-faced killer, the moment when a predator decided that killing was not enough, that the world needed to know, to fear, to recognize him. The smiley face letters, scrawled in ink, became as much a part of his legacy as the bodies he left behind. And as the rain fell on the highways of America, Jesperson's truck rolled forward, carrying him toward his next victim, his next letter, his next moment of recognition. When Keith Jesperson killed Tanja Bennett in January of 1990, the act itself satisfied an urge that had haunted him since childhood. But what followed was equally important in shaping the killer he would become. 2 innocent people, Laverne Pavlinak and John Sosnovsk, confessed falsely to Bennett's murder and were convicted. For many killers, this would have been the perfect outcome: freedom secured, attention diverted, and the crime all but erased. But for Jesperson, the satisfaction was incomplete. The murder was his, and he wanted the world to know. The recognition mattered almost as much as the act. It was this need that birthed one of the strangest rituals in American true crime, the happy face letters. It began quietly. Jesperson, sitting in his truck between long hauls, thought about Bennett's murder and about Pavlinak and Sosnovsk. He had watched their case unfold in newspapers and on television, and what he saw filled him with resentment. They were in the spotlight, their names tied to the crime, their faces broadcast to the public. He, the real killer, was invisible. For a man who had grown up ignored, ridiculed, and dismissed, invisibility was unbearable. He decided to change that. The first letter was short, handwritten in blocky script. It contained details about Bennett's murder that had never been released to the public, proof that the writer was more than a crank seeking attention. At the bottom of the page, Jesperson drew a crude smiling face. It was almost childlike in its simplicity, 2 dots for eyes, a wide arc for a mouth. But its meaning was chilling. Jesperson had chosen his symbol. This was not merely a confession, it was a claim of identity. He signed it not as Keith Jesperson, but as the Happy Face Killer. He mailed the letter anonymously to the Oregonian newspaper. In newsrooms, editors are accustomed to receiving wild letters from self-proclaimed killers, most of them hoaxes. But this one was different. The details matched too closely with the known facts of Bennett's murder, and the inclusion of the smiling face was too odd, too distinctive, to ignore. For the first time, the public caught a glimpse of Jesperson's desire to be known. The killer had stepped out of the shadows, not by showing his face, but by sketching one. Jesperson would go on to write more letters, sending them to newspapers, police departments, and sometimes even prosecutors. Each one contained confessions, each signed with the happy face. In them, he taunted authorities, insisting that Pavlinak and Sosnovsk were innocent, and that he was the true killer. Yet even as he claimed responsibility, he reveled in the confusion he created. The justice system had already secured convictions, and courts rarely overturned such outcomes based on anonymous letters. Jesperson knew this, and the knowledge gave him a sense of power. He was both revealing himself and hiding at the same time, both confessing and mocking the inability of authorities to act. The letters revealed much about Jesperson's psychology. For him, killing was not only about domination in the moment of violence but about ownership afterward. He wanted to be the storyteller of his own crimes, the one who dictated how they were remembered. The happy face symbol was a stroke of grotesque genius, simple enough for anyone to recognize, unsettling enough to stick in memory, and ironic in its contradiction. What could be more disturbing than pairing the innocence of a smile with the brutality of murder? Each letter was a performance, a way of carving his identity into the public imagination. But the letters also exposed Jesperson's deep insecurity. He had grown up dismissed as awkward and clumsy, overlooked by peers, ignored by women, mocked by his father. Even his first murder had been stolen from him, at least in terms of recognition. By writing the letters, Jesperson was demanding to be seen. He did not want to be just another nameless killer hidden in the shadows of America as highways. He wanted to stand apart, to be infamous, to have his own name, or at least his own symbol, etched into the lore of crime. The press, as always, played its role. Once the letters became public, headlines seized on the name Happy Face Killer. It was catchy, eerie, and perfect for front pages. The smiling face symbol appeared in news stories, a grotesque emblem of menace. Jesperson followed these reports obsessively, clipping newspapers, listening to radio broadcasts, relishing the growing fear and curiosity his letters inspired. The more attention he received, the more he wrote. In some letters, he described details of his killings that shocked even seasoned investigators. He wrote about strangling women, about the look in their eyes as life faded, about how easily bodies could be dumped along highways without anyone noticing. The tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were describing routine tasks. But then came the flourish, the happy face, drawn with casual strokes, mocking the gravity of his words. The effect was chilling, the banality of evil coupled with the playfulness of a childish doodle. Jesperson's letters also served another purpose. They acted as advertisements for his next killings. By confessing to Bennett's murder while hinting at others, he created anticipation, a sense that more bodies would be found, more confessions would follow. He was feeding a narrative in which he was the central figure, the hidden author writing from behind the wheel of a truck. The smiley face was not only a signature but a brand, and Jesperson was building it with every envelope he mailed. At times, the letters revealed contradictions that exposed his troubled psyche. In some, He expressed frustration that innocent people had been convicted for his crime, almost as if he wanted justice for them. In others, he gloated about the deception, mocking authorities for their failures. The tension reflected Jesperson's own divided identity, the lonely man seeking validation, and the predator reveling in cruelty. He wanted to be both feared and understood, both monster and misunderstood victim of circumstance. The letters allowed him to inhabit both roles at once. For investigators, the letters were maddening. They had a confessed killer in prison for Bennett's murder, yet here was someone else providing credible details. Were they dealing with a hoaxer or with the real murderer? The lack of physical evidence tying Jesperson to the crime at that point meant the letters remained curiosities rather than definitive proof. And so Pavlinac and Sosnovsk remained behind bars, their lives shattered by lies and systemic failures, while the true killer continued to roam free, smiling from the shadows. Jesperson's obsession with recognition did not fade. As he continued to kill in the early 1990s, the letters followed. Each new victim was another opportunity to write, to confess, to expand the mythology of the happy-faced killer. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that his mobility and anonymity would keep him safe. The letters gave him the thrill of dancing on the edge of exposure. He wanted to be seen but not caught, to confess but not punished. It was a game, and for several years he played it well. The happy face letters stand today as some of the most distinctive artifacts of Jesperson's crimes. They reveal the mind of a killer who was not content simply to kill but who needed to be acknowledged, to have his actions validated by the public eye. They also underscore the failures of the justice system, which allowed innocent people to suffer while the real murderers sent mocking notes through the mail. And they show how fragile the line is between anonymity and infamy, a line Jesperson crossed with every crude smiley face he drew. Looking back, the letters are perhaps as haunting as the murders themselves. Each one is a reminder not only of lives lost but of the casual cruelty of a man who saw murder as both act and performance. They are symbols of a killer who turned violence into a narrative, who branded himself with a smile, who sought fame through fear. The happy-faced killer was born not only in blood but in ink, in the simple, chilling curve of a drawn mouth. For Jesperson, the letters were triumph. They gave him the recognition he craved, the notoriety he believed he deserved. For the rest of the world they were a warning that a predator was out there hiding in plain sight, writing from the cab of a truck and smiling as he confessed to crimes no one could yet fully count. And so the story of Keith Jesperson moved forward, from the first murder to the first letters, from private fantasy to public identity. The happy faces, crude and mocking, announced to the world that a killer was writing. And as his truck rolled down the highways of America, Jesperson was already hunting his next victim, ready to add another body to the road and another letter to the pile. The highways of America in the late 1980s and early 1990s were arteries of commerce and movement, but for Keith Jesperson they became hunting grounds. The endless stretches of asphalt, the neon glow of truck stops, the anonymity of rest areas, all provided the perfect camouflage for a man who lived in transit. By the time he began killing regularly, Jesperson had learned to use his job as both cover and opportunity. His truck gave him freedom, his size gave him intimidation, and his loneliness gave him motive. On those lonely roads, he crossed paths with women who, like him, were living on society's margins, prostitutes, hitchhikers, runaways. For them, the road was survival. For Jesperson, it was a stage for murder. His victims often went unnamed for years, their lives reduced to descriptions in police reports. Female, mid-20s, transient. Many had families who never knew where they were, or families too estranged to search for them. Jesperson understood this vulnerability. He targeted women whose disappearances would not spark immediate investigations, women whom society already looked past. It was the same invisibility he had felt all his life, now twisted into an advantage. In his mind, killing them was easy not only because he could overpower them, but because no one else seemed to care if they lived or died. After Tanja Bennett, his violence escalated. Jesperson himself later confessed to killing at least 8 women, though he hinted at many more. The pattern was chillingly consistent. He would meet a woman on the road, perhaps at a truck stop, perhaps hitchhiking on the shoulder. He would offer a ride, sometimes food or money. His size and calm demeanor made him seem trustworthy at first. Inside the cab of his truck, however, the atmosphere changed. When he decided to strike, his hands, massive, powerful, became instruments of death. Most of his victims were strangled, his preferred method. He claimed it gave him control, allowed him to feel the life leaving their bodies, to watch their eyes dim as his grip tightened. For Jesperson, strangulation was not just killing, it was domination, the ultimate proof of power over another human being. One of his victims was a woman named Claudia, a sex worker he picked up during a stop. Jesperson later recalled the encounter with chilling detachment. He described how he invited her into his truck, how they talked casually at first, and how quickly he shifted from conversation to violence. He beat her, raped her, and strangled her. Afterward, he dumped her body like refuse, confident that she would be forgotten. To him, she was not Claudia, not a person, but another moment of control, another step in the cycle of killing that had consumed him. Another victim was Cynthia Lynn Rose, a young woman known to work the streets near a truck stop in Turlock, California. She entered Jesperson's truck willingly, likely seeing him as just another client. But once inside, she became trapped. Jesperson later claimed she was demanding money and sex, and when he refused, she threatened him. In his telling, her assertiveness became justification. He strangled her in the cab of his truck, later dumping her body behind a truck stop. Investigators found her corpse, but had little evidence to go on. For months, her death remained another unsolved case, one among many along the highways. Only later, when Jesperson confessed, did her story re-emerge, not as the memory of a woman, but as another notch in the record of the happy-face killer. Then there was Laurie Ann Pentland, a 30-something woman he met in Salem, Oregon. She was struggling financially, turning to sex work to survive. Jesperson solicited her, but after a disagreement about money, the situation turned violent. He claimed she tried to back out of the arrangement, and in his rage at being denied, he strangled her. To Jesperson, these moments always came with rationalizations. She insulted him, she demanded too much, she threatened him. But beneath the excuses was the same truth: his rage at women, his need to dominate, his inability to handle rejection. Laurie's body was discovered soon after, but once again the case went cold. A murdered sex worker did not command much attention, and Jesperson knew it. The pattern continued with women like Angela Surprise, another sex worker who crossed his path. Jesperson later confessed to killing her during a heated argument in his truck. Her body was found near a roadside ditch, but without witnesses or connections to Jesperson, the crime remained unsolved for years. Each murder reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. The road was his ally, carrying him far from the scenes of his crimes. The anonymity of his victims shielded him further, their invisibility in society making them perfect prey. For Jesperson, the killings became routine, almost mechanical. He described them later with the same tone one might use to discuss changing a tire or filling a gas tank. His words revealed a chilling lack of empathy. He did not see his victims as individuals but as opportunities. Each woman was a means to satisfy his urge for control, to reenact the powerlessness of his childhood in reverse. Where once he had been mocked and belittled, Now he held life and death in his hands. Yet even as he killed, Jesperson sought recognition. The happy face letters continued, and in them he hinted at the growing list of victims. He described the ease with which he killed, the lack of suspicion, the way bodies vanished along the highways. He boasted of his strength, of his ability to silence women with his bare hands. The smiley face symbol at the end of each letter mocked both his victims and the authorities. He was daring them to find him, to match the anonymous confessions with the bodies piling up. But for years, they could not. Jesperson's choice of victims reflected both convenience and contempt. Prostitutes and hitchhikers were accessible to him, often desperate enough to accept a ride from a stranger. But they also represented something deeper in his psyche. Jesperson resented women who rejected him, who demanded more than he was willing to give, who reminded him of his own failures with intimacy. Killing them became his way of taking revenge on an entire gender that he felt had mocked him since youth. In his warped logic, every victim was not just an individual but a symbol of all the rejection he had endured. The bodies left behind told their own story. Strangled, beaten, discarded near highways, they bore the marks of rage and control. Investigators who found them were often baffled. There was no clear pattern, no single jurisdiction to tie them together. A body in California, another in Oregon, another in Washington. Each looked like an isolated crime, tragic but disconnected. Jesperson relied on this disarray. He knew the distances he traveled made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. Where one case ended, another began hundreds of miles away. It was the perfect camouflage, and he exploited it mercilessly. Jesperson later admitted that he killed at least 8 women, but hinted at more. Some investigators believed the real number could be higher, perhaps a dozen or more. For a man who spent most of his life on the road, the opportunities were endless. Every hitchhiker thumbing a ride, every woman working a truck stop, every passerby he encountered alone at night, all were potential victims. The highways were filled with faces, and Jesperson decided which of them would vanish. What is perhaps most chilling about these murders is not just their brutality but their banality. Jesperson described them as if they were inevitable, as if each victim was simply a matter of chance encounter and opportunity. The violence was not impulsive in the way of a bar fight or a domestic argument. It was methodical, repeated, practiced. He had rehearsed these acts in his mind since childhood, and now he was living them out in the cab of his truck, one woman at a time. For the families of his victims, the pain was compounded by uncertainty. Many did not know for years what had happened to their daughters or sisters. Disappearances along highways often went uninvestigated, chalked up to runaway behavior or lifestyle choices. Only when Jesperson confessed did some families learn the truth, and even then, the details were more horrific than they could bear. Their loved ones had not simply vanished, they had been brutalized by a man who saw them as disposable. By the mid-1990s, Jesperson's confidence was soaring. He believed he could kill indefinitely, that the road would always protect him, that the happy faces he drew on his letters would remain an anonymous taunt. But cracks were beginning to show. His need for recognition was growing, and with it, his willingness to expose himself. The same ego that drove him to kill was also driving him toward capture. The victims on the road had given him power, but they had also fed a hunger that could not be satisfied. Jesperson's killing spree revealed not only the cruelty of one man but also the vulnerabilities of society, the invisibility of marginalized women, the fragmentation of law enforcement, the apathy toward crimes against prostitutes and hitchhikers, all created the perfect environment for the happy-faced kill. Are to operate. In that sense, his murders were not only personal acts of violence, but also reflections of systemic failures. Each body left on the roadside was both a victim of Jesperson and a victim of neglect. The victims on the road are often remembered only in passing, their names overshadowed by the killer's symbol. But their stories matter. They were women navigating difficult lives, women whose paths crossed fatally with a predator in a truck. Their silence speaks louder than Jesperson's letters, reminding us that behind every smiling face he drew was a life extinguished, a family scarred, a tragedy hidden in the vastness of the highways. And as Jesperson continued his journey, smiling from the cab of his truck, more women would vanish. Each death was another secret he carried, another story he wrote with his hands, another confession waiting to be scrawled beneath a smiling face. By the mid-1990s, Keith Jesperson had become accustomed to life as both predator and phantom. He prowled highways with the quiet confidence of a man who believed himself invisible, taking women into his truck, strangling them, and discarding their bodies like debris along America's endless roads. His victims were scattered across multiple states, their cases fragmented among overworked police departments. Each body looked like an isolated tragedy rather than part of a larger pattern. Jesperson relied on that fragmentation. For years, it worked. But what he did not account for was his own ego. The same hunger for recognition that pushed him to draw smiley faces at the bottom of his anonymous letters would eventually be the force that brought him down. His capture began not with a dramatic chase or a sudden mistake, but with a slow unraveling of his double life. Jesperson had tried, for periods of time, to live like an ordinary man. He had relationships, including one with a woman named Julie, whom he seemed to genuinely care for. He spent time with his children from his first marriage. He worked, he paid bills, he made efforts to appear normal. But behind the facade, the killings continued, and with each one came the letters, confessions signed with that mocking happy face. The letters grew more elaborate, more taunting. And the law enforcement struggled to piece them together. Jesperson's name was edging closer to discovery. The true break came after the murder of a woman named Julie Whittingham in early 1995. Unlike most of his victims, Julie was not a stranger picked up on the roadside. She was Jesperson's girlfriend. They had been together for several months, an unusually close relationship for him. Julie was described by those who knew her as warm, open, and hopeful for a stable future. But Jesperson's volatile temper and need for control poisoned the relationship. Arguments escalated, trust eroded, and Jesperson grew increasingly paranoid that she might expose him or betray him. In March 1995, after a heated confrontation, Jesperson strangled Julie, just as he had strangled his other victims. But this time, the murder was different. Julie's death drew attention in ways his other killings had not. She was not a transient or a sex worker. She was connected to Jesperson personally. Her body was discovered quickly, and investigators soon learned of her relationship with Jesperson. For the first time, there was a direct line connecting the predator to his prey. The anonymity of the highways, which had long protected him, now failed. Police questioned Jesperson, who gave evasive answers. His towering presence, his nervousness, his inconsistencies, all drew suspicion. Meanwhile, Jesperson was beginning to feel the walls close in. For years, he had killed with impunity, confident in his ability to outwit the system. But now the system was circling him. Investigators tied him to Julie's death, and Jesperson knew it was only a matter of time before they uncovered more. His solution was as dramatic as it was reckless. He decided to confess, but not out of guilt. His confession was driven by the same need that had fueled his letters. He wanted recognition, validation, ownership of his crimes. He wanted the world to know that the happy-faced killer was real, and that he was Keith Jesperson. In March 1995, Jesperson scrawled a confession on the wall of a bathroom in a truck stop. The words were crude but unmistakable. He claimed responsibility for multiple murders, signing his declaration with the now familiar smiling face. It was both a taunt and a cry for acknowledgement, a bizarre public performance of his identity. Investigators soon linked the writing to the anonymous letters they had been receiving. The circle was tightening. Shortly afterward, Jesperson wrote a series of detailed letters to his brother. In them, he confessed to killing multiple women, describing the murders with chilling detachment. His brother, horrified, turned the letters over to law enforcement. These confessions, coupled with the mounting evidence tying Jesperson to Julie Winningham's murder, gave police what they needed. On March 30, 1995, Keith Jesperson was arrested in Washington state. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Jesperson did not resist. He did not attempt escape. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. After years of carrying the weight of his secret life, he now had an audience, detectives, prosecutors, journalists, who would listen to his story. During interrogations, Jesperson spoke with eerie calm. He confessed not only to Julie's murder but to others, recounting details that matched unsolved cases across multiple states. His memory was precise, his tone devoid of remorse. He described the sensation of strangling women, the control he felt, the ease with which he disposed of bodies. To him, these were not crimes but accomplishments, events that confirmed his power over others. Investigators were stunned by both the breadth of his confessions and the casual way he delivered them. Jesperson seemed eager to talk, eager to catalog his crimes. It was as if the years of writing anonymous letters had built up a pressure that now demanded release. At last, he could step out from behind the smiley face and reveal himself as its author. For him, this was not a downfall but a form of victory. He had forced the world to see him. The scale of Jesperson's confessions created immediate challenges for law enforcement. He claimed to have killed as many as 160 people, a number so large that investigators doubted its accuracy. Many of these claims could not be verified. Some appeared to be exaggerations, the product of a man who craved notoriety. But even setting aside the grandiose numbers, there was no question that Jesperson had murdered multiple women across several states. At minimum, he was responsible for 8 confirmed murders. The exact number may never be known. What made Jesperson's confessions even more disturbing was his lack of remorse. He spoke of his victims as if they were objects, tools for his gratification. He described their final moments not with empathy, but with fascination, as though recounting an experiment. When asked why he chose strangulation, he explained that it allowed him to feel the life leaving their bodies, to experience complete control. His words revealed not only cruelty but also a chilling logic. Murder was, for him, the ultimate assertion of power, the one place where he was never mocked, never rejected, never powerless. As Jesperson continued to confess, the media descended. Reporters seized on the story of the happy-faced killer, the truck driver who left bodies across the country and letters signed with a smiling face. The irony of the symbol, the sheer size of Jesperson, the mystery of his true body count all combined to make him a national figure. Jesperson reveled in the attention. He gave interviews, wrote letters from jail, and seemed almost to enjoy the process of becoming infamous. For a man who had lived in obscurity for so long, who had been dismissed as clumsy and awkward, the spotlight was intoxicating. Yet even in confession, Jesperson continued to manipulate. He alternated between claiming vast numbers of victims and minimizing his responsibility. At times, he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, as someone driven by forces beyond his control. At other times, he gloried in his violence, painting himself as a master predator. Detectives quickly realized that while Jesperson was willing to confess, he was not always truthful. He blended fact with exaggeration, confession with performance. Sorting truth from lies became its own challenge. Still, the core of his story was undeniable. Women were dead, their bodies found along highways, their stories forgotten until Jesperson reclaimed them as his own. His confessions gave closure to some families, but also inflicted new wounds. To hear a killer describe in clinical detail how he ended the life of a loved one was a cruelty of its own. Jesperson seemed indifferent to this pain. His concern was always for himself, for how he was perceived, for whether he was receiving the recognition he believed he deserved. The capture of Keith Jesperson marked the end of his reign on the highways, but not the end of his presence in the public imagination. He had given himself a name, a symbol, a brand. The happy-faced killer was not only a criminal but a character he had created, a grotesque persona that merged violence with performance. Even in chains, Jesperson continued to write letters, to give interviews, to insist on his place in the world. He had finally been seen, and that was all he had ever wanted. For investigators, Jesperson's arrest was both a relief and a reminder. Relief because a predator who had evaded justice for years was finally caught. Reminder because his case exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. The invisibility of his victims, the fragmentation of law enforcement across states, the eagerness to close cases with false confessions, all had given Jesperson the freedom to kill. His capture did not erase those failures. It simply highlighted them. For Jesperson himself, capture was not an ending but a transformation. He was no longer the anonymous trucker writing letters signed with a happy face. Now he was the man behind the symbol, the face behind the smile. His confessions, his calm explanations, his lack of remorse, all cemented his place in the dark gallery of American serial killers. And yet, unlike many before him, his story was not one of secrecy and silence. It was one of performance, of a man who wanted the world to know, who wanted his murders not only committed but recognized, recorded, remembered. As he sat in jail, awaiting trial, Jesperson seemed almost content. He had killed, he had confessed, and he had finally forced the world to pay attention. For a man who had grown up mocked and invisible, that was its own form of triumph. But for his victims, for their families, and for the communities he haunted, there was no triumph, no closure. There was only the memory of lives stolen and the mocking smile of a killer who believed. Recognition was worth more than remorse. When Keith Jesperson was finally arrested in March of 1995, the capture marked only the beginning of a new chapter in his transformation from an anonymous predator of the highways into a public figure of infamy. The road that had long sheltered him, the vast anonymity of truck stops and empty stretches of interstate, had given way to walls and bars. But for Jesperson, this shift was not simply about confinement, it was about an audience. Where once he had written his anonymous happy face letters to newspapers, he now had reporters outside the courthouse, prosecutors in suits, and jurors who would be required to hear his story. In many ways, the trial was exactly what he had been reaching for all along, a stage upon which his crimes would be recognized. The first formal charge brought against Jesperson was the murder of his girlfriend, Julie Winningham. This was the crime that had finally unraveled his carefully maintained double life. Unlike his earlier victims, Julie had direct ties to him. She was not a nameless hitchhiker or a sex worker picked up on a roadside. She had been in his life, connected to him in ways police could trace, and her murder was impossible to hide. Her death gave prosecutors the strongest foundation for their case. From there, investigators began to connect Jesperson to other murders he had confessed to during interrogation, slowly building a broader picture of his crimes. The courtroom atmosphere during Jesperson's hearings was heavy with unease. The man seated at the defense table was massive, towering over nearly everyone in the room, his size a constant reminder of the physical power he had wielded against his victims. Yet he carried himself with an unsettling calm, often speaking with a measured tone that made his confessions even more chilling. Reporters noted how he seemed at ease recounting details of strangulations, as if he were describing routine tasks rather than acts of brutal violence. For the prosecution, the challenge was not in proving that Jesperson had killed Julie Winningham. The evidence was clear, his confessions detailed. The challenge lay in presenting the broader picture of who he was, a serial killer who had left victims scattered across several states, many of them previously unsolved cases. Jurisdictional boundaries made it difficult to consolidate all the murders into a single trial, but prosecutors worked together, state by state, to bring charges forward. In Oregon, in California, in Washington, the name Happy Face Killer appeared in court documents, each case another fragment of his bloody trail. Jesperson himself seemed almost cooperative. He did not deny killing Julie. He did not even deny killing others. In fact, he appeared eager to admit to them, though his admissions were often laced with exaggerations. At times, he claimed dozens, even hundreds, of victims, numbers investigators could never verify. This pattern of overstatement became a defining feature of his court appearances. Jesperson was not merely confessing, he was performing. He wanted to appear larger than life, to cement his place alongside the most notorious serial killers in history. The exact body count mattered less to him than the perception of scale. During pre-trial hearings, defense attorneys attempted to present Jesperson as someone shaped by a violent childhood, as a man whose life had been warped by abuse, bullying, and psychological damage. They hinted at the possibility of mental illness, suggesting that his confessions should be viewed through the lens of a troubled psyche rather than as pure criminal intent. But Jesperson himself often undermined these arguments. He spoke with too much clarity, too much calculation, for jurors to believe he was detached from reality. He described the mechanics of murder, the thrill of control, the cold logic of choosing victims unlikely to be missed. These were not the ramblings of someone lost in delusion. They were the deliberate recollections of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The sentencing phase of Jesperson as trial revealed perhaps the starkest contrast between his inner world and the suffering he had caused. Families of victims came forward to deliver impact statements, speaking through tears about daughters, sisters, and mothers who had vanished only to be found lifeless and discarded. They described the years of uncertainty, the pain of not knowing what had happened, the horror of learning that their loved ones had been strangled by a man who now sat calmly just feet away. For them, the trial was not a stage, it was a wound reopened. Their words carried raw grief, but Jesperson listened with the same expressionless calm he had shown throughout. Occasionally, he nodded, as though acknowledging facts. Rarely did he display any sign of remorse. In 1995, Jesperson accepted a plea deal in the case of Julie Winningham's murder. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, a pragmatic decision that secured him a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For prosecutors, this was a victory. It ensured that Jesperson would never again walk free. For Jesperson, the deal allowed him to continue speaking, confessing, and corresponding without the looming threat of execution. It also guaranteed continued media coverage. The trial might have ended, but his role in the public eye did not. Over the next several years, additional charges were brought against him in connection with other murders. In each case, Jesperson confessed. In some, he provided details only the killer could know, leading investigators to link him definitively to victims whose deaths had once been mysteries. In others, his claims were harder to verify. Still, prosecutors pursued what they could, securing additional life sentences. In total, Jesperson would ultimately receive multiple life terms, each one stacking on top of the other, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The public fascination with Jesperson's trial stemmed not only from the brutality of his crimes, but from the incongruity of his persona. Here was a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, whose presence was physically overwhelming, yet who spoke with the calm tone of a trucker recounting miles driven. The happy face symbol added another layer of horror, a childish doodle attached to confessions of murder. It was the grotesque simplicity of that symbol that made the story stick in the public imagination. In court, Jesperson never tried to distance himself from the name. If anything, he leaned into it, embracing the identity he had created. One of the most haunting aspects of Jesperson's trial was the issue of the wrongful convictions connected to Tonja Bennett's murder. Laverne Pavlinak and John Sosnovsk, who had falsely confessed years earlier, had spent time in prison for a crime Jesperson had committed. Their cases were eventually overturned once Jesperson's confessions were verified, but the damage had already been done. Pavlinak had sacrificed her own freedom in an attempt to escape an abusive relationship, only to be branded a murderer. Sosnovsk had been painted as a killer by association. The revelation that Jesperson was the true murderer exposed the deep flaws of the justice system, and highlighted how easily desperation and poor investigation could lead to devastating miscarriages of justice. Jesperson's trial, then, was not just about his guilt, it was about the larger failures surrounding his case. The invisibility of his victims, the eagerness of authorities to accept false confessions, the lack of coordination across states, all had allowed him to continue killing for years. The court hearings laid bare these failures, even as they secured his permanent imprisonment. When the final sentences were read, there was no dramatic outburst from Jesperson. No visible remorse, no pleas for forgiveness. He accepted his fate with the same detachment he had shown throughout. For him, prison was not the end of his identity, but the continuation of it. Behind bars, he remained the happy-faced killer, writing letters to journalists, communicating with those who sought to study or profit from his story. He had achieved what he wanted: recognition, a name that people knew, a place in the dark history of crime. The families of his victims were left with less than closure. For some, his confessions provided answers to questions that had lingered for years. But answers did not erase grief. Knowing how their loved ones had died, hearing Jesperson describe it without emotion, only deepened the wounds. Life sentences could keep him confined, but they could not undo the violence he had inflicted, nor the years stolen from those women's lives. Jesperson's trial and sentencing became a grim reminder of how justice often functions, imperfectly, belatedly, incompletely. It caught him, yes, but only after multiple murders, after innocent people had been wrongfully imprisoned, after families had endured years of agony. For Jesperson, the trial was another chapter in his quest for recognition. For everyone else, it was the end of a nightmare that had stretched across highways, across states, across lives. In the end, the sentencing ensured that Keith Jesperson would spend the rest of his days in prison, his life defined by walls and bars rather than by endless stretches of road. But the smile he had drawn at the bottom of his letters lived on, etched into headlines, crime documentaries, and the memories of those who survived his reign. That crude drawing, simple, mocking, unforgettable, became his true signature, the symbol of a man who turned murder into performance, and a justice system that only belatedly stopped him. Keith Jesperson entered prison in the mid-1990s with multiple life sentences stacked upon his shoulders, but confinement did not strip him of the one thing he had always craved most: attention. For a man who had lived in shadows, hidden in the cab of a truck as he prowled America's highways, Prison paradoxically gave him visibility. The world now knew his name, his crimes, and, most infamously, his chosen identity as the happy-faced killer. Behind bars, Jesperson embraced this role with a disturbing eagerness. He did not wither in obscurity, as some criminals do. Instead, he sought to maintain his relevance, to cultivate a legacy that would outlast even the memory of his victims. From the beginning of his incarceration, Jesperson kept writing. Letters to journalists, letters to law students, letters to curious correspondents who reached out after reading about his case. He answered them all. His handwriting became instantly recognizable, especially when he drew the crude smiley face at the bottom of his pages. For Jesperson, each letter was not merely correspondence but an extension of his performance, a continuation of the theater he had begun with his anonymous notes to newspapers. Prison bars had changed his stage, but not his script. In his letters, Jesperson recounted details of his murders, sometimes with chilling precision, other times with exaggeration. He hinted at more victims than could ever be confirmed, inflating his body count to numbers so vast that investigators dismissed many as fabrications. Yet even those fabrications served a purpose. They made him appear larger than life, a killer whose true scope could never be known, whose shadow stretched across highways from coast to coast. Jesperson seemed to relish this ambiguity. The uncertainty kept his name in circulation, kept journalists and criminologists returning to him with questions. Whether the number was 8 or 80, Jesperson was content as long as people kept asking. He also gave interviews, sometimes to major news outlets, sometimes to smaller productions eager to feature the happy-faced killer in documentaries or books. In these interviews, Jesperson spoke with the same calm detachment he had shown in court. He described strangulation as if it were a technical skill, recounting how his hands tightened, how his victims struggled, how their lives slipped away. He rarely expressed remorse. Instead, he seemed fascinated by his own ability to dominate, to control life and death with sheer physical strength. For viewers, the effect was chilling, the banality of evil dressed in the casual tone of a man describing his job. Inside prison, Jesperson adapted quickly to the routines of incarceration. His physical size made him a figure both intimidating and respected among other inmates. But he was not content to simply fade into the background. He sought recognition even within prison walls, positioning himself as someone with a story to tell. Guards, fellow prisoners, and even prison staff sometimes remarked on his unusual openness. Unlike many killers who denied or minimized their crimes, Jesperson leaned into his infamy, almost as if proud of the title he had created for himself. One of the most unsettling aspects of Jesperson's life behind bars was his continued manipulation of narrative. He remained fixated on how he was perceived, on shaping his own story. In letters, he often portrayed himself not just as a killer but as someone ruined by circumstance, a man shaped by abuse, mocked in childhood, driven by forces beyond his control. At other times, he glorified his crimes, painting himself as a master predator who had eluded law enforcement for years. This duality, victim and villain, misunderstood man and proud killer, allowed him to maintain a complex persona that fascinated and disturbed those who studied him. Jesperson's correspondence also revealed a dark form of charisma. He engaged with people on the outside who were drawn to him, whether out of morbid curiosity, academic interest, or something more unsettling, attraction. Like many notorious killers, Jesperson received letters from admirers, some of whom expressed sympathy, fascination, or even affection. He responded to them, sometimes forming extended pen-pal relationships. For Jesperson, these exchanges fed the same need that had driven his happy face letters, the need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. Over time, Jesperson's story became embedded in the broader culture of true crime. Documentaries, books, and television programs featured him, each adding to the mythology of the happy-faced killer. His crude smiling face appeared in graphics, his letters quoted in ominous tones. Jesperson himself seemed aware of this growing cultural presence. In some interviews, he commented on how he was portrayed, as though monitoring his own legacy. He had become not just a killer in the record of law but a character in the narrative of crime, a place he had long craved. But what of his victims? In many ways, Jesperson's legacy has overshadowed them. The women he killed, Tanja Bennett, Cynthia Lynn Rose, Laurie Ann Pentland, Angela Surprise, and others, were often remembered only in relation to him. Their names were footnotes in the larger headline of the happy-faced killer. Jesperson's continued correspondence, his interviews, his eagerness to claim more victims than could be proven, all served to keep him at the center of the story, pushing the women he strangled further into the margins. It is a cruel irony. The man who preyed on society's forgotten women ensured, even in prison, that he remained unforgettable, while they remained overlooked. The justice system ensured that Jesperson would never walk free. With multiple life sentences, his days are now measured not in miles driven on highways but in the monotonous routines of prison life. And yet, from within his cell, he has continued to project his voice outward. He has written essays, provided commentary on his own crimes, even engaged in self-styled reflections about morality and justice. Some of these writings reveal flashes of insight into his psyche, others are self-serving, designed to maintain his relevance. He cannot let go of the need to be heard. Silence, for Jesperson, would be a fate worse than imprisonment. In assessing his legacy, criminologists often point to the unique role of his letters. While many killers seek recognition in one way or another, Jesperson's creation of the happy face identity was striking in its simplicity and effectiveness. A crude drawing became a symbol, a brand, one that endures decades later. It encapsulated the disturbing blend of childlike playfulness and adult brutality that defined him. That symbol remains his most enduring contribution to the cultural memory of crime, a reminder that evil often cloaks itself in the banal and the absurd. Jesperson's case also forced law enforcement and the justice system to confront uncomfortable truths. His ability to kill across multiple states without detection highlighted the lack of coordination among jurisdictions. His wrongful displacement of guilt in the Bennett case revealed how easily investigators can be misled, how fragile justice can be when pressured by the need for closure. And his continued manipulation of narrative from within prison underscored how killers can shape their own legacies, sometimes at the expense of victims' memories. Today, Keith Jesperson remains incarcerated in the Oregon State Penitentiary. He is in his late 60s, still writing, still communicating, still watching as documentaries retell his story. His name is permanently etched in the annals of American true crime. For some, he is studied as a case of psychopathy, of the interplay between abuse, rejection, and violence. For others, he is remembered simply as the happy-faced killer, the man who signed his murders with a smile. For the families of his victims, however, he is something far less abstract, the man who stole their daughters, their sisters, their loved ones, and replaced them with silence. The legacy of Keith Jesperson is therefore a paradox. He achieved what he wanted: recognition, infamy, a name that endures. But his story also serves as a cautionary tale about the hunger for attention, about the fragility of justice, and about the way killers can eclipse their victims in the public imagination. Behind every smiling face he drew lies a life extinguished, a family broken, a tragedy too easily forgotten. In the quiet routines of prison life, Jesperson continues his quest for relevance. He writes, he speaks, he engages, refusing to fade into obscurity. But outside those walls, the world remembers him not for wisdom or insight, but for the cruelty he inflicted. His legacy is not the smiling face he drew, but the countless tears shed by the families of his victims. And yet, he would likely be content with that legacy, so long as it means his name is remembered. The happy-faced killer remains a haunting figure, not just because of what he did, but because of what he wanted: recognition at any cost. Even in chains, he found a way to smile. When the final gavel fell and Keith Jesperson was locked away for the rest of his natural life, it might have seemed like the story had ended. Yet, in truth, endings in true crime are rarely clean. The courtroom sentences that placed Jesperson behind bars forever were legal conclusions, but they were not the emotional conclusions for the families, the communities, or even the man himself. His imprisonment was a victory for justice, but it left behind echoes, unanswered questions, and the enduring shadow of a killer who, even in captivity, refused to disappear into silence. For Jesperson, prison was not the punishment it might have been for another man. His hunger for recognition, for acknowledgement, for a place in the world's gaze, did not wither behind bars. Instead, he leaned into it. While the highways and motels had once been his stage, now the prison mailroom became the gateway to the outside world. He corresponded with journalists, students, criminologists, even the morbidly curious who reached out to him. His words, filtered through pages, continued to echo in books, articles, and documentaries. He was confined physically, but his presence extended beyond prison walls, his identity as the happy-faced killer becoming immortalized in ink and image. And yet, despite his efforts to keep his name alive, Jesperson's story carries with it a deeper tragedy: the overshadowing of the women he murdered. Tanja Bennett, the first known victim whose life was snuffed out in 1990, is often remembered primarily because her murder exposed flaws in the justice system and led to false convictions. Before Jesperson's letters forced the truth to the surface, Cynthia Lynn Rose, Laurie Ann Pentland, Angela Surprise, and others became case numbers attached to Jesperson's name, rather than remembered for who they were. The women had their own lives, their own struggles, their own humanity. But Jesperson's insistent need for attention ensured that in the public memory he loomed larger than the people he destroyed. The legacy of the happy-faced killer, then, is not just about the man himself, but about the failures and fractures he revealed. His crimes highlighted how easily vulnerable women could vanish along America's highways, their disappearances barely investigated because of who they were and how society saw them. They were runaways, sex workers, hitchhikers, women living on the margins, women considered disposable by a culture that too often looked away. Jesperson exploited that invisibility, confident that no one would notice, that no one would connect the dots. And for years, he was right. It was only his ego, his need to scrawl confessions and taunts, that brought him down. The system alone had not been enough. Behind bars, Jesperson received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again. But even within prison, he managed to manipulate perception. He alternated between claiming remorse and boasting of additional murders. He hinted at dozens, even hundreds, of victims, muddying the waters between fact and fiction. Law enforcement could confirm only 8, but Jesperson's own words left the possibility that others had slipped through unnoticed, their bodies lost to time and distance. This ambiguity became part of his legacy, a killer whose true count might never be known, whose story was forever incomplete. For the families of his victims, closure was elusive. A life sentence did not bring back the women they had lost. Hearing Jesperson describe their final moments with clinical detachment reopened wounds rather than healed them. For some, knowing the truth after years of uncertainty was a bitter relief. For others, it was unbearable, a permanent scar. Their daughters and sisters were not characters in a true crime story, they were real people, taken violently and without mercy. Jesperson's case also remains a cautionary tale about the justice system itself. The wrongful convictions of Laverne Pavlinak and John Sosnovsk in the Bennett case were stark reminders of how easily justice can go astray. Pavlinak, seeking escape from an abusive relationship, confessed to a murder she did not commit, dragging Sosnovsk with her. Both were imprisoned until Jesperson's letters exposed the lie. Their ordeal demonstrated how desperation, poor investigation, and the need to close cases can lead to devastating consequences. Jesperson did not just kill women, indirectly, he fractured more lives through the ripples of his crimes. Today, Keith Jesperson remains in the Oregon State Penitentiary, aging within the confines of a cell but still reaching outward through letters and interviews. He has become one of those names that true crime enthusiasts recognize instantly, not because of the scale of his killings, which remain uncertain, but because of the branding he gave himself. The happy-faced killer is a moniker as unsettling as it is memorable, a grotesque contradiction between the innocence of a childlike doodle and the horror of strangled lives. It is that smile, more than anything else, that ensures his name will not fade even as his body one day inevitably does. Yet perhaps the most important part of his legacy is not Jesperson himself, but what his story forces us to confront. It is about the way society views certain victims, how easily some lives are deemed less worthy of attention. It is about the blind spots in law enforcement, the difficulty of connecting crimes across states, the way a single predator can exploit those gaps to devastating effect. And it is about the unsettling truth that sometimes killers are caught not by diligent policing but by their own egos, their compulsion to confess, to be seen. Jesperson was undone not because investigators pieced the puzzle together, but because he could not bear the thought of his story going unheard. In the end, Jesperson's life is a paradox. He killed to feel powerful, to assert control, to silence rejection. Yet the same need for power that drove him to murder also drove him to expose himself. His desire for recognition, for a legacy, ensured that he could never remain hidden. The smiley face that he used as a signature was both his mask and his undoing. It was his way of saying, "I am here, done, I matter. Remember me." And the world has remembered, though not in the way he might have wanted. He is not remembered as a great man or a powerful figure. He is remembered as a killer, a manipulator, a predator who took lives and replaced them with silence. As the years pass, Jesperson's name remains in documentaries, podcasts, and books, but the voices that deserve to be heard are those of his victims. The women who trusted him for a ride, who believed his calm exterior, who paid with their lives. They are the true story, the quiet tragedy beneath the headlines. Jesperson's smile may endure as a symbol, but it should never eclipse the reality of the lives he destroyed. And so the tale of the happy-faced killer ends not with redemption or repentance, but with confinement and memory. Jesperson will die in prison, his letters eventually yellowing, his interviews fading into archives. Yet the crude smile he drew will remain a reminder of the darkness that hides in plain sight, of the dangers of invisibility, of the way one man's hunger for attention left behind a trail of death. It is a reminder, too, that true endings are rare. For the families of his victims, for the communities that feared the highways he stalked, for the justice system that failed too often, the ending is still unfinished, the wounds still raw. In the quiet of a prison cell, Keith Jesperson continues to live out his days, writing, remembering, perhaps even smiling to himself. But outside those walls, the world remembers him not with admiration but with unease, a permanent symbol of cruelty wrapped in a smile. The happy-faced killer has become a story, a warning, a shadow cast across America's highways. And in that story, perhaps, lies the only justice left, not that he is remembered, but that we remember why.